A frozen room in Philadelphia, a dead cousin's dress, 3 coins, 1 borrowed name. Cora Montgomery had nothing left but a desperate choice, and that choice carried her all the way to Texas, where a harsh ranch, a grieving mother, and a guarded cowboy would teach her that home is not where your name is written, but where your soul is finally seen.
The frost didn't care about the rent. It climbed the window pane in jagged teeth. It bit the marrow. In that small gray room in Philadelphia, Cora Montgomery watched her breath bloom into a ghost. On the bed lay a dress, black, simple. It belonged to her cousin, the real Cora Miller. 2 days ago, they had buried her in a potter's field. Typhus was a thief, but it was a fast one. Cora looked at the letter on the table. It was from a lawyer in a place called Rattlesnake Flats, Texas, a land of dust and distance. "Uncle Horace," she whispered. The letter promised 40% of a ranch to a girl named Cora Miller. It promised a life, a way out, a chance to stop being a ghost in a city that didn't know her name. She picked up the envelope. Her fingers were blue at the tips. She had 3 coins left, not enough for a week of bread, certainly not enough for a grave. "Forgive me," Cora said to the empty room, "but you don't need a name anymore, and I don't have a life left without one." She packed 1 bag. She took the black dress. She took the name. The train was a rolling iron beast. It smelled of coal smoke and unwashed skin. For 3 days, Cora watched the world turn from green to brown. The sky grew until it felt like it might swallow the tracks whole. Across from her sat an older woman. Her face was a map of every wind that had ever blown across the plains. Her eyes were sharp. They were the color of flint. "You're holding that letter like it's a prayer," the woman said. Her voice was like gravel in a tin cup. Cora pulled her shawl tighter. "It's a map to a new life, I suppose." "I'm Martha," the woman said. "Martha Thorne." Cora hesitated. The lie tasted like copper in her mouth. "I'm Cora Miller." Martha didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just watched Cora's hands. Cora's hands were soft. They were the hands of a teacher, not a girl who had spent a lifetime under a Texas sun. "You look like a girl running toward a cliff," Martha said. "Is it a lie or a truth you're chasing?" Cora looked out the window. The sun was setting over the horizon, bleeding red across the scrub brush. "I'm chasing survival, Mrs. Thorne." Martha leaned forward. She didn't whisper. She spoke clearly, the way a person speaks when they want the world to hear the lesson. "Listen to me, child," Martha said. "A name is just a sound we make with our throats. It is a label on a jar, but the spirit behind the name, that is what the world judges. You might change your name to find safety, but do not let a desperate moment turn you into a cruel person. Survival is a reason to fight, but it is never an excuse to lose your soul. Every human being has a right to start over, but they must do it with a heart that stays kind." Cora felt the weight of those words. They were heavier than the coal smoke. "I don't want to be cruel," Cora said. "I just want to be free." "Freedom isn't just running away," Martha replied. "It's being able to look in the mirror and know that the person looking back is honest, even if the world calls them by the wrong name. You remember that. Dignity isn't given to you by a lawyer, it's something you keep for yourself." The whistle shrieked. It was a lonely, piercing sound. "Next stop," the conductor yelled. "Rattlesnake Flats." Cora stood up. Her knees were weak. She felt like she was stepping off the edge of the world. "Go on," Martha said, her eyes softening just a fraction. "Go see what kind of woman you're going to be. Just remember, the land doesn't care what's on your birth certificate. It only cares if you're brave enough to stand on it." Cora stepped onto the platform. The air was dry. It smelled of sage and horse sweat. And there, leaning against a post with a piece of paper in his hand, was a man. He was tall. His hat was low. He looked like he was carved out of the very rock of the mountains. The paper in his hand said, "C. Miller." Cora took a breath. She smoothed her borrowed dress. She walked toward him. The lie began today, but the survival started now. He didn't move. He stood there like a cedar post driven deep into the Texas dirt. His hat was low. His eyes were shadowed. He held a piece of paper with my borrowed name on it. It was crumpled at the edges. I stopped 3 feet away. The dust from the train was still settling on my shawl. It felt heavy. Everything felt heavy. "I'm Cora Miller," I said. The lie didn't catch in my throat this time. I had practiced it for 1,000 miles. It was a shield now. The man looked me up and down. He didn't do it like the men in Philadelphia. He didn't look at the curve of my waist. He looked at my boots. He looked at my hands. He looked at the way I held my bag. He was measuring me. He was seeing how much wind it would take to blow me over. "Silas Thorne," he said. His voice was a low rumble. It sounded like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't take my bag. He just turned and started walking toward a buckboard wagon. "Follow me," he said. "The horses don't like to wait." Neither do I. I followed. I had no choice. The sun was a hammer. The heat was a physical thing. It pressed against my chest. It made the air feel thick. We reached the wagon. He climbed up and waited. I had to hoist my own bag and climb onto the hard wooden bench. He flicked the reins. The wagon lurched. Rattlesnake Flats disappeared behind a cloud of red grit. We drove in silence for a long time. The silence out here wasn't like the silence in a room. It was vast. It was a heavy curtain drawn across the world. There were no trees, just scrub brush and cactus. Just a sky that went on forever until it hurt your eyes. Finally, Silas spoke. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "My Uncle Horace was a fool," Silas said. I shifted on the seat. The wood was biting into my legs. "He was family." "He was a dreamer," Silas countered. "He spent 20 years building Thorn Ridge. He bled for every acre. Then he goes and leaves 40% of it to a girl he hasn't seen since she was in pigtails. A city girl. A girl who probably thinks milk comes from a tin can." "I can learn," I said. Silas let out a short, dry laugh. It had no humor in it. "You can't learn this dirt," he said. "Either it's in you or it isn't. You'll be gone by the first frost, maybe sooner. The sun will bake the softness out of you. Then the wind will blow what's left away." He reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me. "That's an offer," he said. $300. It's a fair price, more than fair. It's enough to get you back to Philadelphia, enough to keep you in tea and biscuits for a year. Take it. Sign the land over to me. I'll drive you back to the station tomorrow morning." I looked at the paper. $300. In Philadelphia, that was a fortune. It was a life. It was safety. I could go back. I could find a new room. I could be Cora Montgomery again. But then I thought of the frost on the window. I thought of the hunger. I thought of the gray, stifling walls of the city. I folded the paper. I didn't sign it. I put it in my pocket. "No," I said. Silas pulled the horses to a stop. He turned his head slowly. For the first time, I saw his eyes clearly. They were dark. They were tired. They were the eyes of a man who had fought for everything he had. "Don't be stubborn," he said. "I'm trying to be practical. This isn't a storybook. This is work. Hard, ugly work. Why would you stay here when you have a choice to go back to comfort?" I looked at him. I made sure my voice was steady. I wanted him to hear the truth. "Listen to me, Mr. Thorne," I said. "You talk about comfort like it's a gift, but comfort without a home is just a slow way to disappear. I spent 10 years in a house where I didn't belong. I spent 10 years being told what I was worth by a man who saw me as a piece of furniture. I didn't come here because I'm a dreamer. I came here because every human being has a basic God-given right to a place of their own. They have a right to stand on a piece of ground and know they won't be kicked off it because of someone else's whim." Silas didn't move. He just listened. "You think I'm soft," I continued. "Maybe I am. But being soft doesn't mean I don't have a right to my own life. It doesn't mean my 40% is worth less than yours just because I don't have calluses on my hands yet. Human dignity isn't something you earn with a shovel, Silas. It's something you're born with. and I'm not selling mine for $300. The silence came back. But it was different now. It was a challenge. Silas looked at the horses. He looked at the trail. He didn't apologize. Men like him didn't know how, but he didn't reach for the paper either. "The house is 5 miles out," he said. He snapped the reins. "The guest room is at the top of the stairs," he added. "Martha made the bed. Don't expect a servant. We eat at 5. If you're late, the food is cold. If you're late twice, there isn't any." "I won't be late," I said. We rode on. The sun started to drop. The shadows of the cacti grew long and thin like fingers. I felt the paper in my pocket. The $300. It felt like a weight. But the land? The dirt beneath the wheels, that felt like hope. I wasn't Cora Montgomery anymore. I wasn't even the real Cora Miller. I was just a woman standing her ground, and for the first time in my life, the ground didn't move. The morning didn't wait for permission. It broke over the horizon like a fire. I was awake before the sun. The habit of the schoolhouse was still in me. I dressed in the dark. The guest room smelled of cedar and old dust. It was clean. Martha Thorne had seen to that. I found Martha in the kitchen. She was moving with a quiet, steady rhythm. She was kneading bread. Her hands were rhythmic. Thump, fold, turn, thump, fold, turn. "You're early," she said. She didn't look up. "I've never liked the smell of a wasted morning," I said. Martha stopped. She looked at me. A small, dry smile touched her lips. "Neither did Horace. Sit. Coffee is on the stove." I sat. The coffee was strong. It tasted like charcoal and fire. It woke up my blood. "Silas is in the barn," Martha said. "He's been out there since 4. He's a man who carries the world on his shoulders because he doesn't think anyone else is strong enough to help with the load." "He offered me money to leave," I said. Martha went back to the bread. "I know. He thinks he's protecting the ranch. He doesn't realize that sometimes you protect a thing so hard you end up strangling it." After breakfast, I didn't go to the barn. I went to the small room off the parlor. Silas called it the office. It was a mess of papers and ledgers. It smelled of ink and stale tobacco. I started with the ledger on top. Most people see numbers as a chore. I see them as a story. I see the way they lean. I see the ink. I see the patterns. My mind has always been a trap for details. Once a thing goes in, it never comes out. I read through the last 2 years of tax filings. I read the cattle sale receipts. I read the grain bills. I didn't move for 3 hours. I didn't even blink. I was halfway through the spring tally when I saw it, a smudge, a digit that had been changed, a 4 that used to be a 7. It was subtle. It was the work of a man who was careful, but not careful enough for a woman who remembers every ink stroke. I followed the thread. Every 3 months there was a discrepancy, a clerical fee paid to the county, a processing tax that didn't exist in the books I had studied in Philadelphia. The name at the bottom of every receipt was the same, Deputy Gideon Blackwood. I was still staring at the page when the door creaked. Silas stood there. He was covered in a fine layer of gray dust. He looked at the books in front of me. He looked annoyed. "Those aren't school books, Cora," he said. "That's business, real business. You won't find any poetry in there." I didn't look up. I pointed to the entry in May. "Who is Gideon Blackwood?" I asked. Silas stepped into the room. He frowned. "He's the deputy. He handles the county's legal filings. Why?" "Because he's stealing from you," I said. Silas froze. Then he let out a harsh breath. "Don't talk nonsense. Gideon is a pillar of this town. He helped Horace with the deed. He's helped me with the water rights. You've been here 24 hours. You can't just walk in and point fingers." I stood up. I picked up the ledger. I held it out to him. "Look at the ink," I said. "This entry on the 12th. The ink is a different shade of black. It's fresher. And look at the handwriting. The 7 has been turned into a 1. It's consistent. Every quarter for 2 years, exactly 5% of your profit disappears into a fee that doesn't appear in the official county charter." Silas took the book. He squinted at the page. He walked over to the window to get better light. He was silent for a long time. I could hear his heart beating. No, that was mine. "How did you see this?" he whispered. "I've looked at these books a dozen times." "I don't just look, Silas," I said. I remember. I remember the entry from last November. I remember the slant of the pen. My mind keeps a record of everything it sees. It's not a trick. It's just how I'm built." Silas put the book down. He looked at me, truly looked at me. The annoyance was gone. It was replaced by a strange, sharp curiosity. "You're a teacher," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. "I was," I said. "And I've learned one thing, Silas. Truth doesn't care about your gender. It doesn't care if you're a rancher or a school marm. A lie is a lie, whether it's told in a saloon or written in a ledger." I walked closer to him. I wanted him to see that I wasn't just a guest. I was a partner. "Listen to me," I said. "This is a lesson you need to hear plainly. People in this world like to divide us. They say men are for the heavy lifting and women are for the soft words. They say strength is in the arm and wisdom is in the home. But that is a false division. It is a way to keep the world small." Silas didn't blink. "Intelligence is the great equalizer," I said. "It is the only weapon that doesn't require a holster. My mind is just as capable of defending this land as your Winchester. You want to protect this ranch? Then stop looking for a reason to send me away and start looking at what I can actually do. We are equal in this, Silas. Not because of a will and not because of a name. We are equal because we both have the capacity to see the truth and the courage to act on it. Respecting a woman's mind isn't a kindness you do for her. It's a necessity for your own survival." Silas looked back at the ledger. He ran a rough thumb over the altered digit. "Gideon," he muttered. The man sat at my table. He drank my whiskey. "He thought you were too busy with the dirt to notice the ink," I said. Silas looked at me. He nodded. It was a small movement, but it felt like a mountain shifting. "Maybe he was right," Silas said. "Maybe I was." He picked up the book. He tucked it under his arm. "Martha," he called out. Martha appeared in the doorway. She looked from Silas to me. She saw the ledger. She saw the look on her son's face. "Get the buckboard ready," Silas said. We're going into town." "Why?" Martha asked. Silas looked at me. There was a glimmer of something new in his eyes. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something harder and more durable. It was respect. "Because Miss Miller found something," Silas said. "Something that's been hiding in plain sight. We're going to have a talk with the deputy." He started to walk out, then stopped. He turned back to me. "You coming?" he asked. "I'm coming," I said. "Good," Silas said. "I think I'd like to see you explain those numbers to Gideon. I think he deserves to see what a city girl looks like when she's holding the truth." I followed him out into the bright, blinding Texas sun. The lie of my name was still there. But the strength in my voice, that was real. And as we rode toward town, I realized that I didn't need to borrow a name to be a force of nature. I just needed to be seen. And Silas Thorne was finally starting to look. The dust didn't rise for a neighbor. A neighbor's horse has a certain trot, a rhythmic, friendly sound. This was different. This was the heavy, frantic beat of a carriage driven by a man who didn't care for the animal's lungs. It was a city carriage, high-sprung, black. It looked like a hearse coming through the sagebrush. I was standing on the porch. I was snapping green beans into a tin pot. The sound was sharp. Snap, snap. Every crack felt like a warning. Silas was by the corral. He was fixing a gate hinge. He stopped. He wiped his brow with a blue kerchief. He watched that black carriage the way a wolf watches a strange scent. The carriage pulled into the yard. It didn't slow down until the last second. The horses were lathered. White foam flecked their bits. The door opened. My heart didn't just beat. It hammered. It tried to climb out of my throat. Jebediah Vance stepped out. He looked exactly as he did in Philadelphia. He wore a fine wool coat. It was too heavy for the Texas sun. He wore a gold watch chain across a belly that had grown on the labor of others. He carried a silver-topped cane, but in his other hand he carried something else. A riding whip. It was long, tapered, a cruel sliver of braided leather. He looked around the yard with a sneer. He looked at the thorn house like it was a hovel. Then his eyes found me. "Cora," he said. His voice was like a cold wind through a graveyard. It made my skin crawl. "Uncle Jebediah," I whispered. I didn't want to say it, but the words slipped out. A ghost from a life I thought I had buried. Silas walked over. He didn't run. He walked slow, heavy. Every step was a statement. He stood between the carriage and the porch. He was a wall of muscle and sun-darkened skin. "Can I help you, stranger?" Silas asked. Jebediah didn't look at Silas. He looked through him. "I have come for my property," Jebediah said. He pointed the silver tip of his cane at me. "That girl, she is my ward, my brother's daughter. She stole away in the night like a thief. She thinks she can hide behind a dead cousin's name." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even look back at me. "She's a partner on this ranch. She's kin to Horace Thorne." Jebediah let out a sharp, bark-like laugh. "She is a runaway. She is a Montgomery. And I have a debt settlement in Philadelphia that requires her presence. A marriage contract, signed and sealed. She belongs to the Vance estate until I say otherwise." He started toward the porch. His boots clicked on the hard-packed dirt. "Come here, Cora," Jebediah commanded. "Now, before I have to remind you of your place." I didn't move. I couldn't move. I felt like that little girl again. The one who hid in the pantry when the yelling started. "I'm not going back," I said. My voice was thin. It trembled. Jebediah reached the steps. He pushed past Silas, or he tried to. Silas shifted his weight. He didn't touch the man, he just didn't let him pass. "Move aside, plowboy," Jebediah hissed. "This is family business. Legal business." "Not on this ground," Silas said. Jebediah's face turned a mottled purple. He was a man used to being obeyed. He saw me standing there. He saw the defiance in my eyes, even through the fear. He raised the riding whip. It happened fast. A flash of leather in the sun. "You ungrateful wretch," he spat. He swung. He meant to lash my arm. He meant to mark me, to show me who was master, but the whip never landed. Never. Silas moved like a lightning strike. He didn't block the whip. He caught it. His hand closed around the leather midair. He jerked it. Jebediah was pulled off balance. He stumbled. Silas caught the man's wrist in his other hand. A grip of iron. "She belongs to me now," Silas said. The yard went silent. Even the cicadas seemed to stop. Jebediah struggled. He was like a bird in a hawk's talons. You barbarian! Release me! The law says—" "I don't give a damn what the law says in Philadelphia," Silas growled. His voice was a low, dangerous vibration. "I care about what's right in the eyes of God and this land. Get in your carriage. If I see your shadow on Thorn Ridge again, I won't be catching the whip. I'll be using it to tie you to your horse." He released Jebediah's wrist. He tossed the whip into the dust. Jebediah scrambled back. He looked at Silas. He saw a man who would kill him without blinking if he had to. He saw the truth of the West. It wasn't about wool coats and gold chains. It was about who had the strength to hold the line. Jebediah climbed back into the carriage. He didn't say another word. The driver whipped the horses. They tore out of the yard. The black hearse disappeared into a cloud of red grit. I sat down on the porch steps. My legs wouldn't hold me. The tin pot of green beans spilled. They looked like little green fingers on the floor. Silas stood there for a minute. He watched the dust settle. Then he turned around. He looked at me. He didn't look angry. He looked concerned. "You okay?" he asked. He'll be back," I said. "He has papers. He has lawyers." Silas sat down on the step next to me. He didn't touch me. He just sat close. He smelled of hay and hard work. "Cora, look at me," Silas said. I looked. "I need you to hear this," he said. "And I need you to understand it. Truly understand it. Because where you come from, words have one meaning. Out here, they have another." I waited. "I said, you belong to me," Silas began. "And I saw the way you flinched. To that man in the carriage, belonging is a matter of ledgers. It's like owning a cow or a chair. He thinks a person is a thing that can be bought, sold, or broken. He thinks being an uncle gives him the right to dictate the beat of your heart." He shook his head. "But out here," Silas continued, "belonging is a choice. It is a sacred bond of protection. When I say you belong to me, I am saying that you are under the protection of my roof and my name. I am saying that your safety is my responsibility. I am saying that in this world no person is the property of another, not a ward to an uncle, not a wife to a husband, not a daughter to a father." He looked out at the horizon. "Every human being is a sovereign soul, Cora," Silas said. His voice was rhythmic, steady. "They have a God-given right to their own body and their own path. My ownership of you is nothing more than a promise to stand in front of any man who tries to take that path away from you. We don't use people in the West, Cora. We walk beside them. You aren't a piece of property to be traded. You are a woman with a mind and a will, and as long as you choose to be here, that will is your own." I felt the tears then. They weren't from fear. They were from the release of a weight I had carried since I was a child. "I've never been allowed to choose," I whispered. "Well," Silas said. He stood up. He picked up one of the green beans and handed it to me. "You're choosing now, and I reckon you're doing a fine job of it." He went back to the corral. I watched him. He was a simple man. He didn't have a gold watch, but he had a soul that was wider than the sky. I started picking up the beans, one by one. The lie of my name was still there. But the truth of my life, that was finally mine. The heat of the afternoon was a heavy blanket. It pressed against the Thorn Ridge house. It made the wood groan. We were sitting in the parlor. Martha was knitting. The clicking of her needles was the only sound. Silas was cleaning his rifle. I was reading a book. But I wasn't really reading. I was listening to the wind. A rider appeared. It wasn't a carriage this time. It was a single horse, a bay. It moved with a slow, official gait. It was Deputy Gideon Blackwood. He wore his badge on his vest. It caught the sun. It looked like a cold silver eye. He tied his horse to the rail. He tipped his hat to Silas, but he didn't smile. A man like Gideon didn't smile unless he was holding a winning hand. "Silas," Gideon said. "Miss Miller." "Deputy," Silas replied. He didn't put the rifle down. He kept a cloth in his hand. He kept polishing the barrel. Gideon stepped onto the porch. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked into the parlor. He looked around. He looked at me. His eyes were hard. They were calculating. "I had an interesting conversation today," Gideon said. "A man in a black carriage, a Mr. Vance. He had some things to say about the guest you're keeping." Silas didn't look up. "He's gone, and he isn't coming back." "Maybe," Gideon said. "But he left some papers with me. Some interesting papers. Birth records from Philadelphia. Descriptions of a girl who looks a lot like the one sitting in that chair. Descriptions of a cousin who died of the fever." I felt the coldness start in my toes. It moved up to my heart. Gideon walked over to the table. He leaned on it. He looked me right in the eye. "You've got a good head for numbers, Miss Miller," Gideon said. "Or should I call you Miss Montgomery? You saw those entries in the ledger. You pointed a finger at a lawman. That was a mistake." "The truth isn't a mistake, Deputy," I said. My voice was stronger than I expected. Gideon laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "Truth is what I say it is. I have a badge. I have the county's trust. You have a borrowed name and a runaway's past. If I take these papers to the circuit judge, you'll be on a train back to Philadelphia in handcuffs before the week is out." He looked at Silas. "Now," Gideon continued, "I'm a reasonable man. I can make those papers disappear. I can forget about the errors in the ledger. But I want a seat at the table. Thorn Ridge is growing. I want 10% of the quarterly profit. Think of it as a protection fee, protection from the law." Silas stopped polishing. He looked at the rifle. Then he looked at Gideon. "You're asking me to pay you to ignore the fact that you're a thief and a liar," Silas said. "I'm asking you to be smart," Gideon replied. "The law is a tool, Silas. In the right hands, it's a blade. In the wrong hands, it's a noose. You decide which one you want around your neck." Silas stood up. He was taller than Gideon, much taller. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stood there. "Get out," Silas said. Gideon's eyes narrowed. "You're making a bad choice, Silas. A very bad one." "I said get out," Silas repeated. Gideon turned and walked to the door. He stopped. He looked back at me. "I'll be back with a warrant, Miss Miller. Enjoy the sunset. It might be the last one you see as a free woman." He left. We watched him ride away. The silence in the room was thick. It was suffocating. I looked at Silas. "He's right. I'm a fraud. I've put you and Martha in danger. I should go. I can find a way to disappear." Silas turned to me. He put the rifle on the table. He didn't look afraid. He looked focused. "Sit down, Cora," he said. I sat. "Martha," he said, "listen to this too." Martha stopped knitting. She looked at us. "Gideon Blackwood thinks a badge makes him the master of the truth," Silas said. He sat down across from me. "He thinks the law is a cage we all have to live in. But I want you to hear something. Something about the world we're building out here." I listened. "There is the law on paper," Silas began. "And then there is justice in the heart. They aren't always the same thing. A man can wear a badge and be a criminal. A woman can use a different name and be the most honest soul in the county. The law is a set of rules made by men in buildings far away. But justice? Justice is a set of values lived by people on the ground." He leaned forward. "Justice is about the weight of a man's word," Silas said. His voice was rhythmic. "It's about whether he stands by his neighbors. It's about whether he treats a woman with the respect her mind deserves. Gideon thinks that because you broke a rule in a book you are a bad person. But the truth is, the only bad person in this room is the one who uses his power to bully the weak." He reached out. He didn't touch my hand, but he pointed to the ledger on the table. "You pointed out the theft," Silas said. "That was an act of justice. You protected this ranch. You protected Martha. You did the right thing even when it was dangerous. That is what defines you, Cora. Not a name on a birth certificate, not a debt in Philadelphia. You are defined by your actions in the present, not your secrets in the past." Silas looked at Martha. She nodded. "We aren't going to hide, Cora," Silas said. We aren't going to pay a fee. Because when you bow to a bully, you become part of the lie. We are going to stand on the truth. We are going to take that ledger to the sheriff in the next county. We are going to show the world that a man with a badge can still be a thief. And we are going to do it together." I felt a surge of hope. It was a bright, hot spark in my chest. "But the handcuffs," I started. "Handcuffs don't make a person a prisoner," Silas said. "A fearful heart does. You are a free woman because you choose to be. You are Cora Thornridge now if you want to be. Not because of marriage, but because you are part of this land. And this land doesn't care about the deputy's papers. It cares about who has the courage to stay." Martha stood up. She walked over and put her hand on my shoulder. It was warm. It was solid. "He's right, Cora," Martha said. "The law is just words. But a man's character is his destiny. Silas has seen your character. I've seen it. And Gideon Blackwood is about to see it too." The sun began to set. It turned the hills into gold. It looked like the world was on fire. But I wasn't afraid of the fire anymore. "Thank you," I said. Silas picked up his rifle. He started cleaning it again. Swish, swish. It was a rhythmic sound, a steady sound. "Don't thank me," Silas said. "Just keep your eyes on those numbers. We've got a long road ahead, and I reckon I'm going to need a partner who remembers every step of the way." We sat in the parlor as the shadows grew long. We were an alliance. A rancher, his mother, and a woman who had finally found a name worth keeping. The law was coming, but justice was already there. The dawn didn't break. It bled. It seeped over the rim of the world in streaks of bruised purple and angry orange. I stood on the porch. I watched the shadows of the sagebrush retreat. They looked like ghosts hiding from the light. Silas was already at the pump. The rhythmic clank whoosh of the water was the only sound. He was washing the grit of the barn from his arms. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace. He was a man who knew exactly how much space he occupied in the world. I walked down the steps. The air was crisp. It had that sharp, clean smell of high desert morning. "Gideon won't wait long," I said. Silas stopped pumping. He straightened up. He wiped his face with his sleeve. He looked at me for a long time. His eyes were like the horizon, steady, unblinking. "Men like Gideon are like rattlers," Silas said. "They don't strike because they're hungry. They strike because they're afraid of losing their hole. He thinks he's got us cornered. He thinks your past is a cage." He walked over to the buckboard. He leaned against the wheel. "But before we ride out to find the sheriff," Silas said, "I want to do something. I want to show you the north pasture, the part Horace never got to finish." We rode out. The horses moved in a slow, steady trot. We didn't talk for a mile. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had seen each other's scars and decided to keep walking anyway. We reached a ridge. Below us, a valley opened up. It was green, greener than the rest of the ranch. A spring bubbled out of the rock. It fed a small grove of cottonwoods. "Horace wanted to build a school here," Silas said. He stayed on his horse. He looked down at the valley. He thought the children of the flats deserved more than just learning how to brand a calf. He thought they deserved a bridge to the rest of the world. He turned his horse to face mine. "Cora, I want you to hear this," Silas began. "And I want you to listen with your heart, not just your ears. Because this is the most important lesson I can give you about why we're fighting Gideon." I watched him. The sun was behind him. It made him look like a silhouette carved out of iron. "There is a difference between a secret and a lie," Silas said. His voice was rhythmic. It had the cadence of a preacher who had lived in the dirt. "A lie is a tool. You use it to hurt someone. You use it to take what isn't yours. It is a theft of the truth. But a secret? A secret is often just a shield. It is something a person carries to keep themselves safe in a world that isn't always kind." He leaned forward. He rested his hands on the saddle horn. "Gideon wants to call your life a lie," Silas continued. "He wants to say that because you took a name to survive, you are a criminal. But I see it differently. I see a woman who was pushed into a corner by a cruel man. I see a woman who took the only weapon she had, a name, and used it to build a better life. That isn't a crime, Cora. That is resilience. And resilience is the highest form of human dignity." He looked down at the valley where the school was supposed to be. "Equality isn't just about having the same amount of land," Silas said. "It's about having the same right to a future. Gideon thinks he can take your future because he knows your past. But your past doesn't own you. You own it. Every human being has a right to reinvent themselves. They have a right to leave the ash behind and become the flame. To deny a person that right is to deny them their humanity." He paused. The wind stirred the manes of the horses. "That's why we're going to the sheriff," Silas said. "Not just to save the ranch, but to prove that a person's worth isn't found in a dusty record in Philadelphia. It's found in the work they do today. It's found in the way they protect those who can't protect themselves. You are more than a name, Cora. You are a bridge, and I won't let Gideon burn you down." I felt the tears prickling, but I didn't let them fall. I wanted to be as steady as he was. "I've spent my whole life feeling like I was trespassing," I whispered. "Well," Silas said. He turned his horse back toward the house. You aren't trespassing anymore. You're home. And a home is a place where your secrets are safe because your character is known. We rode back. The sun was high now. It was a hot white eye in the sky. When we got to the yard, Martha was waiting. She had a basket packed. She looked at us. She saw the set of Silas's jaw. She saw the light in my eyes. "The sheriff in Bandera is a good man," Martha said. "His name is Miller. No relation to your cousin, I reckon, but he knows the difference between a badge and a bully." "We're leaving at noon," Silas said. He went to the barn. I stayed on the porch with Martha. We started packing the last of the supplies. "He told you, didn't he?" Martha asked. She didn't look up from the saddlebags. "He told me I wasn't a lie," I said. Martha stopped. She looked at me. Her face was lined with 1,000 stories. Most of them were hard, but her eyes were soft. "Healing isn't about forgetting what happened," Martha said. Her voice was quiet, solid. "It's about changing the story you tell yourself about it. You were a victim in Philadelphia, Cora. You were a survivor on that train. But here you are an architect. You are building something new. And an architect doesn't worry about the old ruins. They only worry about the foundation." She patted my hand. "Don't let the fear of being found out keep you from being found," Martha said. "You've been found, child, by us. And that is the only truth that matters." We left at noon. The road to Bandera was long. It was dusty. But for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was riding toward myself. The town of Bandera didn't look like much. It was a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together like they were trying to stay warm in the heat. The dust was thick. It tasted like limestone and old sweat. We pulled the buckboard up in front of the sheriff's office. Silas tied the horses. He checked his belt. He didn't have his rifle, but he had a look on his face that was just as dangerous. "Keep your head up, Cora," he said. "The truth doesn't need to whisper." We walked inside. The office was small. It smelled of old paper and gun oil. A man sat behind a desk. He was older. His hair was the color of wood ash. He wore a star on his chest that looked like it had been there for 20 years. This was Sheriff Miller. "Silas Thorne," the sheriff said. He stood up. He didn't smile, but his eyes were kind. "It's been a long time. Last time I saw you, Horace was still complaining about the price of salt." "He never did stop complaining, Sheriff," Silas said. Silas stepped aside. He introduced me. "This is Cora. She's the one Horace left the 40% to." Sheriff Miller looked at me. He didn't look at me like a deputy. He looked at me like a man who had spent a lifetime weighing the truth in people's voices. "I've heard some talk, Silas," the sheriff said. "Gideon Blackwood sent a rider out this way. He had some papers. He had some accusations." Silas didn't blink. "Gideon is a thief, Sheriff. We have the ledgers to prove it. He's trying to use Cora's past to bury his own crimes. He thinks because she used a name to escape an abusive uncle, she doesn't have a right to justice." The sheriff sat back down. He creaked in his chair. "A name is a legal thing, Silas. The law is a rigid machine. It doesn't usually care about why a person does what they do. It only cares if the box is checked." I stepped forward. I didn't wait for Silas to speak for me. I felt the heat of the room. I felt the weight of the sheriff's gaze. "Sheriff Miller," I began. My voice was steady. It was rhythmic. It sounded like the ticking of a clock in a quiet room. "I need to tell you why memory is more important than a signature," I said. The sheriff tilted his head. "I'm listening." "A signature can be forged," I said. "A name can be borrowed. A badge can be bought. These are things of ink and tin. They are external. But memory? Memory is the witness of the soul. It is the only thing a human being owns that cannot be taken, even if they are stripped of everything else." I looked at the ledgers Silas had placed on the desk. "I remember every entry in those books," I said. "I remember the slant of the ink on the day Gideon stole $50 from the grain fund. I remember the way the paper felt under my thumb when I found the altered tax receipts. I remember the exact date and time he stood in our parlor and tried to extort a protection fee from a man he called his friend. I leaned in. The law says I am a fraud because I am not the Cora written on a birth certificate, I continued. But justice asks a different question. Justice asks, who was there? Who saw the crime? Who has the integrity to stand in this room and tell the truth when it would be easier to run? I am that person, Sheriff. My memory is the evidence. My character is the witness. I took a breath. Silas was watching me. He looked proud. Listen to this lesson, Sheriff, I said, because it is the truth of the frontier. Integrity is not found in a person's pedigree. It is not found in the name they inherited from their father. It is found in the choices they make when they are most afraid. If you punish a person for surviving, you are telling the world that survival is a crime. But if you listen to the truth they carry, you are telling the world that justice is about the heart, not the paperwork. Every human being has a right to be judged by their actions in the light, not their secrets in the dark. The sheriff was silent. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at me. He tapped a rhythmic beat on the arm of his chair. Tap, 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 tap. Gideon is a powerful man in Rattlesnake Flats, the sheriff said. He's a man with a badge and a hollow soul, Silas added. The sheriff stood up. He walked over to a rack and took down his hat. I've spent 30 years in this office, Sheriff Miller said. I've seen men with fine names do the devil's work, and I've seen men with no names at all save a whole town. I don't care much for Gideon Blackwood. Never did. He's always been more interested in the shadow of the law than the substance of it. He looked at me. Miss Montgomery, he said. He used my real name. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a recognition. A memory like yours is a dangerous thing for a thief, and a spirit like yours is a dangerous thing for a bully. I think it's time we rode back to the flats. I'd like to see Gideon's face when he realizes that a fraud is about to put him in a cell. As we walked out to the buckboard, a man stepped out from the shadows of the saloon next door. He was thin. He looked hungry. He wore a suit that was too big for him. He looked like a man who had spent a lifetime losing. Cora, the man whispered. I stopped. I knew that voice. It was a ghost from Philadelphia. Thomas, I said. This was Thomas Haynes, the brother of the real Cora Miller, the man Gideon had hired to identify me. Thomas looked at Silas. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at me. His eyes filled with tears. He told me you were a devil, Cora, Thomas said. His voice was shaking. He told me you stole my sister's life. He gave me $20 to come here and call you a liar. Silas stepped forward, but I put a hand on his arm. I walked toward Thomas. Thomas, listen to me, I said. You know who I am. You know I loved your sister. You know we shared our bread when there wasn't enough to go around. I looked him in the eye. Betrayal is a heavy coat to wear, Thomas, I said. It will weigh you down until you can't stand. Gideon wants to use your grief to hurt a person who never did you wrong. But you have a choice. You can be a tool for a thief, or you can be a man of truth. Human dignity is not for sale for $20. It is the only thing you have that is worth more than gold. Don't let a small man make you small. Thomas looked at the $20 gold piece in his hand. He looked at me. She's right, isn't she? Thomas asked Silas. She's usually right, Silas said. Thomas squeezed his hand shut. He dropped the coin in the dust. I'm not lying for him anymore, Thomas said. My sister wouldn't want it, and I don't want to carry it. The sheriff nodded. Well, Thomas, I reckon you just became our star witness. Get in the wagon. We've got a long ride, and there's a deputy in the flats who needs to learn that the truth doesn't just float, it bites. We rode out of Bandera. The sun was setting behind us. The shadows were long and thin. Silas reached over and squeezed my hand. The name Cora Montgomery was out in the open now. It wasn't a shield anymore. It was a banner. And as we rode toward the fight, I realized that I didn't need to hide to be safe. I just needed to be true. And for the first time in my life, I was. The moon was a sliver, a pale, sharp thing. It hung over the barn like a hook. The wind had died down, leaving the ranch in a silence so thick you could hear the cattle shifting in their sleep 2 pastures away. I sat at the small desk in my room. I was writing. Not a ledger this time. I was writing a letter to a woman who wasn't there. My cousin, Cora. I wanted to tell her that her name was being used for something good. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't just hiding behind her anymore. I was standing up for her. There was a knock. It was soft, 3 steady beats. Thump, thump, thump. I opened the door. Silas stood there. He wasn't wearing his hat. His hair was ruffled by the day's ride. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright. They held a warmth I hadn't seen before. "You're still awake," he said. It wasn't a question. "Sleep is hard when the truth is finally out in the air," I replied. He leaned against the door frame. He didn't come in. He respected the threshold. "Thomas is asleep in the bunkhouse," Silas said. "Martha gave him enough stew to feed a cavalry troop. I think it's the first time he's felt safe in years." "He was a victim of his own fear, Silas. Gideon just provided the cage." Silas nodded. He looked down at his boots, then back at me. "I came here to say something," he began. He paused. He was a man who chose his words like he chose his horses, carefully, looking for the ones that wouldn't stumble. "I've spent a lot of years being a wall," Silas said. "I thought if I was hard enough, the world couldn't break me. I thought if I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't be betrayed again. I saw your secret as a threat to that wall. I waited." The lamp on the desk flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "But I was wrong," Silas said. His voice was low, rhythmic. "And I need you to hear this lesson, Cora, because I had to learn it the hard way." He took a step closer to the threshold. "Vulnerability is not a weakness," Silas said. "I used to think it was. I thought being open meant being soft. But I've watched you. I've watched you walk into a room with a sheriff and admit you were a runaway. I've watched you stand up to a man with a whip when you didn't have a weapon to your name. That isn't softness. That is the highest form of courage." He looked me right in the eye. "Trust is not a reaction to someone being perfect," Silas continued. "Trust is a choice you make to believe in someone's heart, despite their scars. If we wait for a person to have no secrets before we love them, we'll spend our whole lives alone. Human connection is built on the ruins of our pasts, not the perfection of our presents. Every human being deserves a partner who sees their struggle as a badge of honor, not a reason for shame." I felt the air leave my lungs. "I thought I had to be perfect to stay here, Silas." "No," he said. He reached out. He didn't take my hand, but his fingers brushed the wood of the door near my arm. "You just had to be true. And you are the truest thing I've seen in a long, long time." He stayed for a moment, just looking at me. It wasn't the look of a rancher checking a worker. It was the look of a man who had finally found the other half of a conversation he'd been having with himself for years. "Good night, Cora," he whispered. "Good night, Silas." He walked away. I watched his shadow move down the hall. I turned back to my letter, but I didn't write about the past anymore. I started writing about tomorrow. The next morning, the ranch felt different. The air was charged. It felt like the minutes before a thunderstorm. Martha was in the kitchen. She wasn't cooking. She was sitting at the table with an old, yellowed envelope. She looked up when I walked in. "It's time," Martha said. Silas came in from the porch. He saw the envelope. He sat down. Thomas Haynes followed him, looking nervous but steady. Martha opened the envelope. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This was Horace's last letter to me," Martha said. "He told me to open it only when the right person came to claim the 40%. He didn't say Cora Miller. He said the right person." She began to read. Her voice was clear. It had the weight of the years in it. "Martha," the letter began, "if you are reading this, A girl has arrived. Maybe she is my niece, Cora. Maybe she isn't. The world is a hard place for a girl with no family, and names can be lost in the wind. But hear me. The land doesn't belong to a name. It doesn't belong to a bloodline. It belongs to the soul that needs it most, and the heart that will cherish it. If she is brave enough to come all this way, and if she has the grit to stand on this soil, then she is the heir I intended. The name is just ink. The character is the deed. Let her stay. Let her build. For the frontier is made of those who had the courage to leave their old names behind. Silas looked at me. He didn't look surprised. He looked like he had finally heard someone say out loud what he already knew in his gut. He knew, I whispered. He knew the world was broken, Silas said, and he wanted to make sure Thorn Ridge was a place where it could be fixed. The sound of horses broke the moment. Many horses. We went to the porch. Gideon Blackwood was there. He had 6 men with him. They all wore badges. They all had rifles across their saddles. Gideon looked smug. He was holding a pair of heavy iron handcuffs. "Silas Thorn!" Gideon yelled. "I have a warrant for the arrest of the woman known as Cora Miller. Charges of identity theft and fraud. Step aside." Silas didn't move. He stood on the top step. He didn't have a rifle. He didn't need one. "You're a little late, Gideon," Silas said. Sheriff Miller from Bandera rode out from behind the Thorn barn. He wasn't alone. He had 4 deputies of his own. They had their guns drawn. "Gideon Blackwood," Sheriff Miller said, "I suggest you get off that horse. We've had a long talk with Thomas Haynes, and we've had a very long look at some ledgers." Gideon's face went white, then it went red. He looked at Thomas. Thomas didn't look away. "You're listening to a drunk and a fraud," Gideon shouted. "No," I said. I stepped forward. I stood next to Silas. "They are listening to the truth, and the truth is a debt you can't pay back with a bribe, Gideon." I looked at the men behind him, the ones who thought they were serving the law. "Listen to this, all of you," I called out. My voice was rhythmic. It carried across the yard like a bell. "A badge is a promise, not a privilege," I said. "When you put on that star, you are promising to protect the truth, not the man who pays your tab. The law is meant to be a shield for the innocent, not a sword for the bully. If you use your power to crush the weak, you aren't a lawman. You are a criminal with a shiny piece of tin. Integrity is the only thing that makes a badge worth wearing. Without it, you are just a man with a gun and a hollow heart. Justice is not about who has the most papers. It's about who has the most honor." The men behind Gideon looked at each other. They looked at Sheriff Miller. Slowly, one by one, they lowered their rifles. "Gideon," one of them said, "I think you've got some explaining to do." Gideon tried to turn his horse, but Sheriff Miller was faster. He grabbed the reins. "Get down, Gideon," the sheriff said. "You've spent enough time in the sun. I think you'll find the shade of a jail cell much more suited to your character." They took him away. They took his badge. They took his handcuffs. The yard was quiet again. The dust settled. The threat was gone. Silas turned to me. He took my hand. Right there in front of Martha and the sheriff and the whole wide Texas sky. "You stayin'?" he asked. "I don't have anywhere else to be," I said. "And besides, I have a school to build in the North Pasture." Silas smiled, a real smile. It transformed his face. It made him look young. "Cora Montgomery," he said, "I think Horace would be real proud of the deed you're about to write on this land." We walked back into the house. The morning was over. The work was just beginning. But for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was. I was a Thorn Ridge woman, and that was the only name I would ever need. The spring didn't arrive with a shout. It came with a whisper, a soft greening of the hills, the smell of rain on dry stone, the sound of the spring in the North Pasture finally finding its voice. I stood on the ridge, the same ridge where Silas had shown me the bridge. But the bridge wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was made of pine and sweat. It was a schoolhouse. It sat near the cottonwoods, small, sturdy. Its white paint caught the morning light like a beacon. It was the first thing people saw when they rode toward Thorn Ridge. It wasn't just a building. It was a promise. Silas was by the door. He was hanging the bell. He didn't see me yet. He was focused. He handled that bell like it was a piece of fine china. He respected things that had a purpose. I walked down the slope. The grass was knee-high. It brushed against my skirt with a dry, rhythmic hiss. Shh, shh, shh. Like the earth was telling me to keep a secret. Silas looked up. He smiled. It was a slow thing. It started in his eyes. It ended in the corners of his mouth. He climbed down from the ladder. He wiped his hands on his trousers. "She's ready, Cora," he said. "She looks beautiful, Silas." He looked at the building. Then he looked at me. "She looks like hope. And I reckon hope is a hard thing to paint, but you managed it." We sat on the porch steps. The wood was warm. It smelled of sap and sun. "The children will be here on Monday," I said. "Thomas's boy, the Miller twins from the valley, 7 in total." Silas leaned back on his elbows. He looked out at the horizon. 7 mines. That's a heavy load, Cora. You ready for it? I looked at my hands. They weren't soft anymore. They had calluses. They had scars. They were the hands of a woman who had worked for her bread. "I've been thinking about what I'm going to tell them," I said, "on that first day, before we open the books, before we pick up the slates." Silas turned his head. He watched me. "And what's that?" I took a breath. I wanted to say it clearly. I wanted him to hear the lesson I had spent my whole life learning. "I'm going to tell them about the map," I began. My voice was steady, rhythmic. It felt right in the morning air. "I'm going to tell them that the world will give them a map before they even learn to walk," I said. "A map that tells them who they are because of where they were born. A map that tells them they are less because they are poor, or because they are a girl, or because their name isn't on a fancy ledger in a big city." I looked at Silas. He didn't move. He just listened. "But I'm going to tell them that a map is just a piece of paper," I continued, "and a name is just a sound. I want them to hear this clearly, Silas, because it is the foundation of everything we are building here. Your identity is not a cage built by your ancestors. It is not a sentence handed down by a judge or an uncle. It is a house you build yourself, brick by brick, choice by choice. Every human being has an inherent sacred right to define their own worth. They have a right to look at the world and say, 'I am not what you call me, I am what I do.'" Silas nodded. He didn't look away. "Equality isn't something that is granted by a government," I said. "It is a truth that lives in the soul. It means that the child of a ranch hand has the same right to a dream as the child of a king. It means that a woman's mind is just as vast as a man's. We are equal because we all share the same capacity to love, to learn, and to choose. To deny a person their choice is to deny them their humanity, and that, more than any crime, is the greatest sin a person can commit." The wind stirred the cottonwoods. The leaves clapped together like tiny hands. "Choice," Silas whispered. "That's the word, isn't it?" "It's the only word that matters," I said. "Choice is the difference between a prisoner and a person. I chose this ranch. I chose Silas Thorne. I chose to be Cora, not because it was my name, but because it was my life. I want those children to know that their lives belong to them, completely, wholly, without apology." Silas reached over. He took my hand. His palm was rough. His grip was solid. "You're a hell of a teacher, Cora Montgomery," he said. "I'm just a woman who finally found her own voice," I replied. We sat there for a long time. The morning turned into noon. We watched a hawk circle over the valley. It looked free. It looked like it didn't care about names or papers. It only cared about the wind. Martha came up the trail later. She was carrying a basket of sandwiches and a jar of lemonade. She looked at the bell. She looked at us. "It's a fine thing you've done," Martha said. She sat down with us. She looked tired, but her face was peaceful. Horace would have loved the sound of that bell. He used to say that a town without a school was just a camp, a place where people waited to leave. But this makes it a home. We were just talking about choice, Martha, Silas said. Martha poured the lemonade. Choice is a luxury some people never get. But once you have it, you can't ever go back. It's like seeing the sun for the first time. You can't pretend the world is dark anymore. She looked at me. You did a brave thing, Cora, Martha said. Not just coming here, but staying here. Staying is the hardest part of the frontier. Anyone can ride through, but staying, that takes grit. That takes knowing that you're exactly where you're meant to be. As the sun began to dip toward the hills, Silas stood up. He walked over to the bell rope. You want to do the honors? He asked. I stood up. I walked to the rope. I felt the rough hemp in my hand. I pulled. The sound was bright. It was clear. It rang out across the north pasture. It echoed off the rocks. It carried down to the valley. Clang, clang, clang. It was a rhythmic sound, a steady sound. It was the heartbeat of a new world. I looked at Silas. I looked at Martha. I looked at the little white schoolhouse on the hill. The past was behind me. Philadelphia was a gray memory. Uncle Jebediah was a shadow. The lie of Cora Miller was gone. What was left was the truth. I was Cora. I was an architect. I was a teacher. I was a partner. And as the bell continued to ring, I realized that I wasn't just ringing it for the children. I was ringing it for myself. I was telling the world that I was here. I was telling the land that I was home. And for the first time in 30 years, the world seemed to listen. We walked back toward the main house as the shadows grew long. Silas kept his hand on the small of my back. It was a light touch. But it was enough. It was a bridge of its own. The frontier was still hard. The dust was still thick. The work would never be finished. But we were standing on honest ground. We were building a life on our own terms. And as the stars began to poke through the purple sky, I knew that Horace Thorne had been right. The land doesn't belong to a name. It belongs to the soul that stays. I was staying. I was home. This channel is a home for emotional Western storytelling, cowboys of the frontier, Western love, motherly devotion, compassion, human warmth, forgiveness, and the quiet mercy that changes lives. If this story moved your heart, please press like, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a hopeful story today, and subscribe to join us for more touching tales from the Old West. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
As the dust settles over Thorn Ridge, Cora's journey leaves us with a truth as wide and enduring as the western sky. A person is not defined by the name they are given, the mistakes they have made, or the fear that once forced them to run. Cora came to Texas carrying a secret, believing that survival had made her unworthy of trust, love, and belonging. But through hardship, courage, and the kindness of those who chose to see her heart instead of only her past, she discovered that identity is not written only on paper. It is written in the choices we make when life tests us. In the truth we are brave enough to tell, and in the compassion we offer to others when they stand broken before us. This story reminds us that justice is not always found in a badge, a courtroom, or a document. Sometimes justice begins with one honest voice refusing to stay silent. Gideon Blackwood had power, position, and the appearance of authority, but he lacked the one thing that makes any authority worthy of respect: integrity. Cora, on the other hand, had a borrowed name and a wounded past, yet she stood for truth when it mattered most. That is the deeper lesson of this tale. Our worth is not measured by perfection. It is measured by character. It is measured by whether we protect the vulnerable, whether we stand against cruelty, and whether we choose what is right even when doing so may cost us everything. Cora's story also speaks to the sacred human need for belonging. For so long, she believed she was trespassing through life, unwanted and unsafe, always one step away from being cast out. But at Thorn Ridge, she learned that home is not simply a place on a map. Home is where your dignity is protected, where your voice is heard, and where your scars are not used against you. Silas and Martha did not save Cora by pretending her past did not exist. They helped her heal by seeing the truth of who she had become. And in return, Cora brought light, wisdom, and hope to a land that needed more than fences and cattle. She helped build a future. The meaning of this story is that every person deserves the chance to begin again. A name may open a door, but only courage, kindness, and honesty can keep that door from closing. We all carry secrets, regrets, and wounds from roads we wish we had never walked. But those things do not have to be prisons. They can become the foundation of a stronger, wiser, more compassionate life. Like Cora, we may not be able to change where we came from, but we can choose where we stand. We can choose truth over fear, mercy over judgment, and love over control. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson Thorn Ridge gives us. The land does not belong to a name. A life does not belong to the past. A human soul belongs to the choices it makes today. Cora stayed, not because the world finally gave her permission, but because she finally believed she had the right to be there. She found her voice. She found her home. And in doing so, she reminds us all that no matter how far we have run, no matter how heavy our secrets may feel, there is still a place in this world where truth can set us free, where kindness can rebuild what cruelty destroyed, and where a wounded heart can finally say, I am home.